going on, vinyl community? Welcome to another video with the Record Spinner. In today's video, I'm going to be ranking the Queen studio catalog. Now, Queen has quite an immersive catalog. They've never fallen prey to being labeled under one specific genre, and depending on the album, they have dipped their toes in all kinds of different musical waters, such as progressive rock, disco, arena rock, and even Baroque pop and opera. So depending on what styles and influences they were channeling at any given time, it gives each of their albums a distinctive characteristic that makes all of them stand out in a way. Now, let me emphasize by saying that this ranking is solely my opinion. It is neither right or wrong. If you think that Jazz is their best album, then I respect your opinion, but who knows, maybe we'll see eye to eye on a couple things. So enough of the chit chat, let's jump into what this video is all about. So there are 15 Queen studio albums, and coming in at number 15 at the bottom of the barrel is this one. 1980's Flash Gordon. Of course, Queen provided the soundtrack to the film, and by this point, they had fully immersed themselves into the world of synthesizers, which basically went against their whole stigma of having no synthesizers printed on the liner notes of all their albums. It's a very atmospheric soundtrack and very enjoyable. It almost reminds me at times of some of David Bowie's Berlin material, and what's really enjoyable about the soundtrack is that there's all these little bits and pieces of dialogue taken from the film and worked in with the music. So it gives you this notion that even though you're not watching the film, you are listening to the film. But the reason why this album is at the bottom of the list for me is simply because this is a true soundtrack album in all its glory. It's all these little instrumental bits and pieces all compiled onto one LP. There's only like 2 real songs on this. There's Flash's theme, which ultimately got edited down for a single, which was retitled Flash, which I'm sure everyone knows. And then there's the closing track, The Hero, and both those songs were the only tracks performed live off of this record. So it's very tough to see this album mixed in with their other studio albums simply because it is so characteristically different. And it also just kind of feels more so of a Brian May kind of project, which kind of makes sense because he is the only band member listed in the producer credits. But if you're really into 80s sci-fi campy kind of films, then you'll really love this soundtrack. Coming in at number 14 is this album. Let's face it, this was bound to happen. 1982's Hot Space. This was the band's foray into the world of disco and dance music. They figured they had success with Another One Bites the Dust, that they would do a whole album in that sort of vein, and the end result, not quite positive. And it's a real shame because the songs in here, at least most of them, are very strong, but what brings this album down for me is the production style. It bears no resemblance to the classic Queen sound that we had become familiarized with other albums. The heavy usage of synthesizers and programmed drums and whatnot. It's just a little all over the place. And it's a shame because there's songs on here such as like Staying Power and Action This Day, which are amazing performed live. There are some great live renditions of those songs out there, but on record, it just doesn't translate well. And then you get to things like Body Language and Cool Cat, which reign as perhaps some of Queen's worst tracks. But with all that said, there are some silver linings on this album, such as Las Palabras de Amor, and of course, Under Pressure, which was their collaboration with David Bowie, and it's perhaps one of the band's most well-known songs. So there are some rather nice moments on here, but overall, it is pretty much Queen at their worst. Coming in at number 13 is this album, 1989's The Miracle. Now, right off the bat, this is one of my favorite album covers of all time. Something about this cover always struck me as a kid, of seeing the 4 heads of Queen joined together to make one. Perhaps to reflect that sense of unity that was going on within the band at the time, since they were starting to credit all of their songs to the entire band and not just one singular writer. But this album kind of starts off on a bit of a wonky note with things such as Party and Khashoggi's Ship, which are almost like in the vein of power pop with programmed drums and everything. And then you have things like My Baby Does Me, which almost reminds me of Cool Cat off of Hot Space. It's a little all over the place in that aspect. But what brings this album up are the singles. So you have things like I Want It All, which is probably the big highlight off of this record. It would have been an amazing live song if the band was to perform live at the time. Then you have the title track, The Miracle, which is a fantastic song. Features a great music video of kids playing the role of Queen members, and then the band joins them on stage. So awesome. And then you have things like Scandal, which are quite reflective of the times, since there was so much, tabloid press going on in regards to Freddie Mercury's health and Brian May's marriage. And then the album closes with one of their most rocking tunes, and it's another big highlight, Was It All Worth It, which almost seems like a last gasp to come from the band, but in hindsight, it almost works as a preamble to The Show Must Go On Innuendo. Coming in at number 12 is this one. 1995's Made in Heaven. This was the band's last studio album, and it was also released posthumously after Freddie Mercury's death. In early 1991, when Innuendo had come out, Freddie was adamant that he wanted to keep working, so he worked on things such as You Don't Fool Me, A Winter's Tale, which was his last fully written song, and Mother Love, which was his final ever vocal performance, and it's absolutely spine-chilling and amazing at the same time. And he was adamant that those songs should be released, so the band did honor his wishes, but when you're working with 3 songs, how do you go about putting them out on an album? They could have simply done a single, but of course they decided to dig into the vaults and dust off some old bits and pieces and reworked a couple things, such as Heaven for Everyone, which is a song that Roger Taylor's band The Cross did, but Freddie managed to do a vocal take for, I believe it was the single version maybe? Not quite sure, may have been a bonus track on the album. My Life Has Been Saved, which was a B-side from The Miracle, but they did a reworking of it. It's a Beautiful Day, which is a Freddie composition from the Game era, which is just a piano and vocal piece, and the band added some other parts to it. Too Much Love Will Kill You, which is from The Miracle as well. So it's a lot of leftover tracks and such. But what makes it kind of questionable in places are the tracks Made in Heaven and I Was Born to Love You. Those 2 tracks being Freddie Mercury's solo tracks. And it's kind of hard to believe that Freddie would say, take my solo tracks and do what you want with them. Because if the members of Queen can do that to his solo stuff, then hell, they can take all of his solo tracks and turn them into Queen songs and just put out a whole other album. So it's kind of hard to process that, but that's not to say that I don't enjoy their renditions, because they are great renditions, especially I Was Born to Love You. It's a great driving, rocking kind of ballad. I know a lot of people would tend to put this at the bottom of their rankings list, but I decided to have it as up as it is simply because it is an enjoyable album. It's just a very somber listening experience in some cases. Coming in at number 11 is this one. 1986's A Kind of Magic. Now, this album can kind of be seen as a companion piece to the Highlander film, which Queen did the soundtrack for. However, there was no Highlander soundtrack that came out, but this album can kind of act as that. And what's great is, even though that this is a soundtrack album of sorts, it works well because it is a cohesive album. What I see with Queen and what they did with soundtracks is kind of like how I see what Pink Floyd did with soundtracks. The Floyd had the More soundtrack, which is almost like Flash Gordon with the various little instrumental bits and pieces. And then you have Obscured by Clouds, which is a full-fledged album just like this. And this album has the songs that were featured in the film, as well as songs that are reflective of the themes that go on within the Highlander film, such as the title track, Gimme the Prize, Princes of the Universe, 1 Year of Love, and Who Wants to Live Forever, which is such a powerful, emotional song. And then you have other things on here, such as Friends Will Be Friends, and the very Motown-inspired Pain Is So Close to Pleasure. And then you have another amazing track on here with One Vision, which was a track that was written and recorded after the band's triumphant performance at the Live Aid Festival. It really kind of rejuvenated their creative juices within Queen, and they delivered that amazing track. And it was also featured in the movie Iron Eagle. So this is almost like Queen's kind of movie album of sorts, since it features all these various tracks. But otherwise, it's a rather solid album full of some great cinematic tracks. Coming in at number 10 is this album. 1978's Jazz. Now, this album musically is all over the place. But right off the bat, though, we do have some of the band's most well-known songs on here, two of them being rather complementary to each other, Fat Bottom Girls and Bicycle Race. And then we also have Don't Stop Me Now, which is just absolutely sensational. But in terms of the other tracks on here, we have quite the variety. We have the opener, Mustafa, which is a homage to Freddie's Arabic origins. And what's really awesome about that song is that it starts off in very minuscule mono, and then for the chorus, it just explodes in dynamic stereo. It is absolutely spine-chilling when you listen to it on a really good hi-fi setup. It's awesome. And then you have great piano ballads on here like Jealousy. You have a really awesome rockin' live track with Let Me Entertain You. Not recorded live, but when performed live, that's absolutely awesome. In Only 7 Days and Dreamer's Ball, which are kind of more slower paced, almost folky kind of tunes. Fun It, which is almost like their first foray into the world of disco. One of my personal favorites is Brian May's Leaving Home Ain't Easy. And then it ends with More of That Jazz, which kind of reprises all of the songs at the very end, which kind of wraps up the album rather uniquely in a way. Coming in at number 9 is this album, 1984's The Works. Now, this album was a real return to form for the band after just coming off of Hot Space, and honestly, there is not a bad song on this record. Every song on here stands out in its own way. We have some notable singles off of here, such as Radio Gaga. When performed live, the audience is able to participate during the chorus, which is awesome. And then there's I Wanna Break Free, which features a rather infamous video of the band dressing in drag as a reference to Coronation Street, which of course MTV banned because they just simply did not get it. And this album also features some of Queen's most heaviest tracks, such as Tear It Up and Hammer to Fall. It also features one of Freddie's most perfectly written songs, It's a Hard Life. There's a great track on here, which is a collaboration between Brian and Roger called Machines or Back to Humans, which basically deals with that rather familiar concept of humans versus machines and computers, very synthesized. So they're really working in synthesizers tastefully on that track. And then it wraps up with Is This the World We Created, which is a beautiful acoustic piece with Brian and Freddie, almost predating the whole Live Aid thing, which basically when you listen to it, it's very reflective of what the Live Aid Festival was setting out to accomplish in terms of the cause and everything. So it almost seems like that particular song was written specifically for the event, but it surely predates it. Coming in at number 8 is this album, 1980's The Game. This right here is Queen at their peak. This was when they were filling up all the football stadiums down in South America. It features some hit singles such as Crazy Little Thing Called Love, as well as one of the band's biggest hit singles, Another One Bites the Dust, written by John Deacon. And as quiet as that guy was, he was almost like a secret weapon because he was able to churn out hits out of nowhere. And this album was also quite innovative because it was the first Queen album to feature synthesizers, particularly on the opening track Play the Game. And there's also some great deep cuts on here such as Dragon Attack, Rocket Prime Jive, Sail Away Sweet Sister, and the album closes with an awesome single with Save Me. This album basically serves as a snapshot of what the band was setting out to do all their lives, and that was ruling the music world once and for all. Coming in at number 7 is this album, 1991's Innuendo. This was the last album to come out during Freddie Mercury's life, and when you listen to it, you almost get the notion that the band more or less knows that they are working on total borrowed time with Freddie, and this might be their last chance. So they pulled out all the stop, they fired on all cylinders, and the end result was absolutely positive. This is such a fantastic record. It almost reminds me of A Night at the Opera in some cases. It's almost like they're rediscovering their youth by delving into all different types of musical waters on this album. Starts off with a very boisterous title track, which is almost like Queen does Zeppelin. There's a lot of Kashmir influences on here. There is a Spanish flamenco section right in the middle, which was performed by Steve Howe of Yes. And then there's a brief operatic bit. It almost reminds me in terms of structure like Bohemian Rhapsody. There's the very quirky I'm Going Slightly Mad. There's some very guitar-heavy moments on here, such as Headlong and The Hitman. There's the very driving Ride the Wild Wind, which is almost like a follow-up to Roger's I'm in Love with My Car. All God's People, which is a almost like a gospel kind of song, which was actually a leftover from Freddie and Montserrat Caballé's Barcelona project. And then there's also the very sentimental Delilah, which Freddie wrote about one of his cats, which is very sweet, and also it's a very unique kind of track. But the thing that's interesting with this album is that at the time, they were really denying the fact that Freddie was dying of AIDS. And that is kind of hard to register when you have tracks on here such as These Are the Days of Our Lives and The Show Must Go On, where it kind of tackles those themes of mortality and life. So, you know, it's quite emotional to listen to these tracks now and to think what was going on at the time. But otherwise, this album is absolutely dynamic and is a fine gem in the Queen crown. Coming in at number 6 is this album, 1976's A Day at the Races. Now, with this album, it seems like they could have released this simultaneously with A Night at the Opera, almost like part 1 and part 2. Maybe coincidentally, since they do share Groucho Marx film titles. But with this album, it sounds like they're doing exactly what they did with A Night at the Opera, but with confidence, whereas the previous album, it was very much a do or die kind of situation. There are some relatively well-known songs on here, such as Somebody to Love and the live staple Tie Your Mother Down. There's also Good Old Fashioned Lover Boy, which was another single off of this. There's also the piano ballad You Take My Breath Away, Brian May's Long Away, The Millionaire Waltz, White Man, which is one of Queen's heaviest songs and also perhaps one of their more political tunes. You don't really see a whole lot of them in their discography. Then there's also Tio Toriate, which is a nice tribute to their Japanese fans. It's the sound of a band going at it with confidence, and it really shines on this album. Coming in at number 5 is this album, 1973's Queen, otherwise known as their self-titled debut album. This is one of the greatest debut rock albums of all time. It features some early live favorites such as Keep Yourself Alive and Liar, the first one being the band's first single. And then there is a track that the pre-Queen band Smile did. Smile, of course, comprised of Brian May, Roger Taylor, and Tim Staffel, that song being Doing All Right. And then it kind of gets into fairy tale, fantasy kind of areas with tracks such as Great King Rat and My Fairy King. And then we kind of dig into the very earliest Queen recordings with The Night Comes Down, which is actually taken from their first demo that they did at Delaney Studios in 1971. And then it gets into raucous territory with Modern Times Rock and Roll, Son and Daughter. Then there's the very biblical Jesus. And then it also ends with a teaser of Seven Seas of Rise. So with this album being mainly deeply rooted in the sort of progressive hard rock vein, there's a lot of variety on here. And it stands out as, like I said, one of the best debut rock albums of all time. Coming in at number 4 is this album, 1974's Queen 2. This album right here is my favorite Queen album of all time, and it more or less picks up where they left off at on their first album, but they take their sound and they turn it into a more sort of dramatic, boisterous kind of direction. There is the guitar orchestrated procession that opens up the album, and then it goes into Father to Son, the very elegant White Queen, one of my personal favorites being Brian's Someday, One Day, the very raucous Loser in the End by Roger Taylor, and then the entire B-side, or black side I should say, since it's side white and side black, is almost like a side-long rock opera, although all the songs don't connect together in terms of themes or meaning. It's just all these songs connected together, and it just sounds so awesome when it's all blended together. We have Ogre Battle, which opens it up. Then it goes into the Fairy Fellers Masterstroke, which is just completely crazy bonkers. Then it simmers down to the piano ballad Nevermore. Then it goes into March of the Black Queen, which is almost like a precursor to Bohemian Rhapsody in terms of its structure. Then it goes into Funny How Love Is, which is almost like a Phil Spector inspired kind of piece. And then it wraps up with Seven Seas of Rhye, which is the band's first, notable single. It is an absolutely adventurous record. It's the band flexing their musicianship and basically doing whatever they wanted to do in the studio. Coming in at number 3 is this album, 1977's News of the World. This album is most notable for featuring 2 of Queen's biggest anthems, We Will Rock You and We Are the Champions. And what's interesting when this album came out was that in 1977, the whole punk rock movement had basically exploded. You had Anarchy on one side, Monarchy on the other, and that punk rock kind of idea comes across in the album's production, which is completely stripped back and not as elaborate as some of their earlier albums. And they even did their own take on punk with the song Sheer Heart Attack, which apparently was written at the same time as the album of the same name was being worked on. So it would have been interesting to hear how it would have sounded if it didn't appear on this album. And honestly, it's hard to imagine because it is one of Queen's most heaviest, frantic tunes. There is the beautiful Spread Your Wings by John Deacon on this. Get Down, Make Love, which is a very risque kind of song with a very ethereal middle section, which is not at all synthesized. It's all Brian May just filtering his guitar through delays and all kinds of effects. There is one of my personal favorites on here, It's Late, which is almost like this little mini epic, which has 3 kind of movements, and it just absolutely rocks from beginning to end. And then it ends with the jazzy My Melancholy Blues. It's an absolutely great record, kind of loosens things up a little bit, drifts away from the sort of fantasy elaborate epics that they were doing early on, and kind of paves the way for their future. Coming in at number 2 is this album, 1974's Sheer Heart Attack. Now, this album features the band's first huge hit with Killer Queen, as well as a great concert opener with Now I'm Here. The album itself opens up with Brighton Rock, which is basically a showcase for Brian May's guitar skills. A lot of the little bits and pieces he would do in his guitar solo live, he actually worked into this song, which is quite cool. The big centerpiece of this album is the little mini suite on side A, which features 3 songs that are all completely different but cross-faded together to make it sound like one big piece. Those 3 songs being Tenement Funster, Flick of the Wrist, and Lily of the Valley. It is just absolutely sensational. And then we have things like Stone Cold Crazy, which is just frantic from beginning to end, almost like thrash metal in places, like the true beginnings of thrash metal. Then we have Bring Back That Leroy Brown, which is almost like Baroque pop in places. And then the album ends with In the Lap of the Gods Revisited, which served as this big impending climax to Queen live shows with this anthemic vocal line that gets repeated as the song progresses, and then the song just explodes at the very end. It's absolutely sensational, fully adventurous, and was quite a close contender to being the band's best album for almost hitting the number 1 spot. But that leaves one more album to be showcased right at number 1, and let's be honest, did you guys see this coming? 1975's A Night at the Opera. And the reason why it's at number 1 is because Bohemian Rhapsody is on it. Need I explain myself anymore? I'm just kidding. This is a make it or break it album for Queen, because prior to this album being worked on, they were poorly managed and their finances were out of order. And due to the stress that ensued with their old management, they were on the verge of almost breaking up. And they hired manager John Reid to work with them. And he said while he would take care of the business side of things, they should go away and make the best record they could possibly make. And sure enough, Queen delivered the best album they ever made. It is an album so musically rich and dense, full of all kinds of various influences and styles. Starts off with Death on Two Legs, which is Freddie's venomous attack on his old managers. Then it breaks into Lazing on a Sunday Afternoon. And then there's Roger Taylor's contribution to the album being I'm in Love with My Car, which anytime I listen to it or I think about it, it always reminds me of that hilarious scene in the Bohemian Rhapsody movie. And then there is John Deacon's You're My Best Friend, which was another big hit for the band as well. 39, which is a great tune by Brian, a nice folky song about a man going to the moon and coming back and realizing that the earth had changed and yet he's 1 year old. It's a great kind of sci-fi folky kind of tune. Seaside Rendezvous, which is a nice piece of Baroque pop. The Prophet Song, which is a nice, heavy, epic piece with the middle section having Freddie's vocals being delayed and being spread across the left and right stereo speakers. It's absolutely sensational. Then there is a beautiful ballad with Love of My Life. And then, of course, Bohemian Rhapsody. It's been said that it's the song of the millennium, the best song ever written. It's truly sensational. Rock opera at its finest. And then it closes with God Save the Queen, which is their take on Britain's national anthem. And of course, it closed all of Queen's concerts after this album. It's a truly remarkable album, and it is, in my opinion, hands down, their best album. So there you guys go. That is my ranking of the Queen Studio catalog. If you enjoyed this video, please go ahead, give it a like, subscribe to the channel. And if you want to support this channel, be sure to check me out on Patreon. See you guys in the next video. And most importantly, keep the records spinning.